June 28, 1914, Sarajevo, a wrong turn on a sunlit street. In 5 seconds, a 19-year-old student will fire 2 shots that echo across the world. Within weeks, empires that have stood for centuries will hurl millions of men into the most catastrophic war humanity has ever witnessed. 20 million dead, 4 ancient empires erased from the map, a generation lost to the machine guns and poison gas of industrial warfare. But here's what they don't tell you. That assassination, it wasn't the cause, it was merely the spark. The real question is, why was the entire world already soaked in gasoline?
The year 1914. Europe is a chessboard of empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire sprawls across Central Europe. Germany dominates the continent's heart. Russia stretches from Poland to the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire controls the crossroads between Europe and Asia. And here's something remarkable. Nearly all of these nations are ruled by kings and emperors. Only 3 countries in all of Europe are democracies: France, Switzerland, and tiny San Marino. This isn't a clash of nations. It's a family feud between cousins wearing crowns. But our story begins in a place most people have never heard of, a region that will earn a terrible nickname, the powder keg of Europe, the Balkans. Let's go back to 1878. Russia defeats the Ottoman Empire, helping Balkan nations break free from centuries of Ottoman rule. But there's a catch. At the Treaty of Berlin, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is handed Bosnia-Herzegovina, not as a prize, but as a so-called temporary administration. For 30 years, this lie holds. Bosnia remains officially Ottoman, but Austria-Hungary rules it. Then, in October 1908, the mask drops. Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia outright. After 4 centuries under Ottoman rule, the Bosnians don't gain freedom, they simply trade one empire for another. Rage explodes across the Balkans. The Bosnians want independence. Their Serbian neighbors feel something deeper, a connection of blood and culture. They are Slavs, South Slavs, and they dream of a nation that doesn't yet exist: Yugoslavia. But here's where it gets interesting. Before Austria-Hungary seizes Bosnia, they make a deal with Russia. Russia wants the Bosphorus, the narrow strait that divides Istanbul and controls access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. Austria tells Russia, "You stay silent about Bosnia, and we won't object when you take the Bosphorus." Russia agrees. But there's a problem: the Russian people. Thousands of Slavic people live in Russia, and when their government agrees to let Austria enslave fellow Slavs in Bosnia, they erupt. The Russian Empire is already weak, fractured by internal unrest. The Tsar cannot ignore the will of his people, so Russia breaks the deal. They back Serbia. Austria-Hungary panics. They turn to Germany and ask, "If we invade Serbia and Russia interferes, will you help us?" Germany doesn't hesitate. "We're old friends, of course." Russia looks to France. "Will you stand with us?" France's answer, "This has nothing to do with us. We're staying out." Without French support, Russia backs down. The war that almost begins doesn't. Austria keeps Bosnia. The crisis passes. The world breathes again for 5 more years. June 28, 1914. The city of Sarajevo buzzes with anticipation. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrives with his wife Sophie to tour their newly acquired territory. But in the crowd, 6 young revolutionaries wait. They are members of Young Bosnia, students, idealists, freedom fighters. They want their country back, and they're willing to die for it. 10 a.m. A revolutionary named Chabranovich throws a bomb at Ferdinand's car. It bounces off the vehicle, explodes in a side street. 20 people injured. Ferdinand escapes. Shaken but alive, Ferdinand changes his plans. He'll visit the hospital to see the wounded, a humanitarian gesture. It will cost him his life. On the way to the hospital, the driver takes a wrong turn. As they attempt to reverse course, the car stalls. 5 feet away, standing on the street corner, is a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. He'd given up. He thought the mission had failed. But fate has delivered the Archduke directly to him. 2 shots, both find their mark. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie die within minutes. Gavrilo Princip is arrested immediately. At his trial, he says he is a Yugoslav nationalist fighting for freedom. Because he's 19 years old, just months too young, he cannot be executed. He receives 20 years in prison. He will die in that prison 3 years later from tuberculosis, never knowing that his 2 bullets changed the course of human history.
1 month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia mobilizes to protect Serbia. Germany declares war on Russia to protect Austria-Hungary. France honors its alliance with Russia. Within weeks, the Ottoman Empire joins the Central Powers. Britain activates the Triple Entente. Italy, promised rewards, switches sides. Japan enters on the Allied side. And every colony, every territory controlled by these empires is dragged into the conflict, including India. More than 1 million Indian soldiers will fight in this European war, not for their freedom, but for their British colonial masters. The assassination was the spark, but the fuel? That had been accumulating for decades. 4 forces drove Europe toward catastrophe. First, nationalism. Not the nationalism of liberation or independence. This was racial nationalism, the toxic belief that your nation was superior, that others were inferior, and that conquest was glory. Bismarck had united Germany in 1871 through nationalism, but the kings and emperors twisted that pride into a weapon. They convinced millions that dying for the nation meant dying for their emperor's greed. Second, imperialism, the disease of empires. Why did these nations want to conquer more territory when they could barely govern what they had? The answer is simple: looting, gold, resources, cheap labor. Capitalists like the East India Company had perfected the art: invade, extract, profit. As Henry Ford himself admitted, "It is well enough that the people don't understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." War wasn't politics, it was business. Third, militarism. In 1870, the 6 great powers spent £94 million on their militaries. By 1914, 4 times that amount. They built the largest armies and navies the world had ever seen, not for defense, for conquest. Britain's Royal Navy ruled the oceans. Germany's army was a machine of precision and terror. And here's the darkest irony: the leaders of these war machines, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, and King George of Britain, were first cousins. World War I was literally a family feud. A game of thrones played with the lives of millions. Fourth, alliances. The Triple Alliance bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The Triple Entente linked Britain, France, and Russia. They were supposed to prevent war through mutual deterrence. Instead, they guaranteed that when war came, everyone would be dragged into it. But here's the question no one asks: why did ordinary people fight? This wasn't their war. These weren't their ambitions. Why would a factory worker in Manchester or a farmer in Bavaria march into machine gun fire for a king's glory? For many, the answer was poverty. Being a soldier was a job. When you have no work, no future, no hope, military service offers a wage. But poverty alone doesn't make men into heroes. For that, you need propaganda. Newspapers glorified war. Poets romanticized death. Alfred Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade turned a military disaster into an act of noble sacrifice. Rupert Brooke's The Soldier made dying for your country sound like the highest calling. When Brooke died in the war, Winston Churchill used his poem as a recruitment tool. But not everyone was fooled. Socialists, anarchists, labor leaders, and religious pacifists opposed the war. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Germany, the Bolsheviks in Russia, the British Labour Party, America's Socialist Party. Writers like Rudyard Kipling wrote counterpoems exposing the horror of war. Wilfred Owen described poison gas, shattered limbs, men drowning in their own blood. Thomas Hardy's poem The Man He Killed captured the ultimate tragedy. Two unemployed men, enlisted as soldiers, met on a battlefield and killed each other. But had they met in a pub, they would have shared a drink and laughed together. And then came Christmas 1914. In the frozen mud between the trenches, something miraculous happened. British and German soldiers stopped fighting. They climbed out of their trenches, walked into no man's land, and celebrated Christmas together. They sang carols, exchanged food, played football. Because these men had no reason to hate each other. They were workers, farmers, sons and fathers, pawns in a game played by kings. The commanders ordered them to stop,
threatened them with execution for fraternizing with the enemy, forced them back into the trenches at gunpoint. The war continued. World War I lasted 4 years. 20 million people died, soldiers and civilians, obliterated by artillery, machine guns, disease, and starvation. 4 great empires collapsed: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The world was redrawn. New nations emerged from the ashes. And the seeds of the next Great War were already planted in the bitter soil of Versailles. Gavrilo Princip never lived to see the world he helped destroy. He died in his prison cell in 1918, his bones ravaged by tuberculosis, his dream of a free Yugoslavia still unrealized. We call it the Great War, the war to end all wars. But it ended nothing. It solved nothing. It only proved that when empires collide and kings play games, it's always the common people who pay the price. This is only the beginning of the story. What happened in those 4 years of hell? How did it end? And what did it cost India and the colonized world? That is a story for another time.